Chapter 11. Berkians know nothing of table manners.
I wonder what Jack is doing,
Jamie mumbled. Gobber stopped his hammering, looking up.
Did you say something?
He asked. His face was covered in soot, making him look even wilder than he normally did. It would have been scary hadn't Jamie gotten so used to him already. Jamie gazed in the direction Jack had disappeared to earlier, towards the forest. There was a tight feeling in his chest, but he didn't know why exactly. Maybe just because remembering what had happened last night made Jamie's heart speed up. What if there were more boars in the forest? Jack had told Jamie there was something he had to do, but Jamie couldn't figure out what that something was. And now that he'd been gone for so long, Jamie was starting to feel uneasy. But Jack knew what he was doing, right? There was nothing to worry about. So he just shook his head.
No,
he said, looking down at his hands. He was sitting atop a table with iron and leather scraps scattered across it. His hands, arms, and legs were aching from working in the forge all day, but it was a good kind of aching. Gobber had asked him to take a break, which was fine. Jamie had already finished forging his first sword, and it was just as interesting to watch Gobber work anyway.
He'll be back soon enough, Gobber said.
Jamie looked up at him, and Gobber sent him a knowing smile. Can't imagine he'd leave you unsupervised for more than 3 hours at best. A bit mistrustful, that brother of yours. Gobber held up the axe he was working on, examining it. Not that anyone blames him, he mumbled. But relaxing a little would be good for him. Maybe he went out to the forest to scream. It works, you know. Jamie frowned, exchanging a look with Baby Tooth. She shrugged.
You do that?
He asked Gobber. When the situation calls for it, Gobber replied with a shudder before going back to his hammering. Jamie exchanged another look with Baby Tooth.
What kind of situation could that be?
He asked under his breath. Baby Tooth chirped in reply with an amused smile, and of course Jamie didn't understand, no matter how hard he tried. How Jack did it, he had no idea.
If you can make us understand Norse, he asked her, can't you just make us understand, Tooth Fairy speak, too?
Baby Tooth tilted her head to the side. She replied, but it was incomprehensible. All Jamie got out of it was the way she shrugged a little. Maybe she didn't know, or maybe there was some kind of tooth fairy law, something that stopped her. He could get Jack to translate later. Just then, the faint sound of a familiar laugh made both Jamie and Baby Tooth perk up. Jack had appeared around the corner, and he wasn't alone. Hiccup and Toothless walked beside him, and they all seemed to be in a good mood. Earlier, Jamie had noticed Jack's gloom, no matter how hard Jack tried to hide it. But now his whole demeanor had changed. Maybe screaming in the woods really was therapeutic. Jamie grinned and jumped down from the table. He grabbed his new sword. It wasn't perfect, but Jamie was happy with it anyway, and ran out of the forge.
Jack, he yelled. Look!
All three of them looked up at Jamie's voice, and Jack's face broke into a wide smile.
Whoa! He laughed as Jamie stopped in front of him. You made that?
Jamie grinned, showing it to Hiccup as well.
What do you think? He asked.
Hiccup hesitated for a moment before he made an impressed face.
That's better than I expected, he said, holding out his hand.
Jamie gave the blade to him and watched as Hiccup turned it over. He nodded approvingly, then handed it back to Jamie.
Good job. Can you teach me how to use it?
Jamie asked. Hiccup blinked. He glanced at Jack, whose smile had faded just a tad.
Well,
he started. I'm sure he can, Jack said, elbowing Hiccup lightly before sending Jamie a smile. You already look like a Viking, so might as well go all the way, right?
Yeah, it's just my dad, Hiccup started, hesitating.
Then he met Jamie's eyes, and he let out a small sigh.
I could try to talk to him. Don't get your hopes up, though.
That was good enough for Jamie. He gripped the sword expectantly, looking between the two of them.
Where were you? He asked.
It only happened for a split second, but Jack hesitated.
I just needed some time to think,
he then said. I feel better now. How about you? Jamie got the feeling there was something Jack wasn't telling him, but he wasn't going to push. It was torture for Jamie's curiosity, but his mom had always told him that if something was hard to talk about, he should wait for the person to open up about it on their own, if they ever wanted to. He hoped Jack would, someday.
I'm a bit hungry,
he admitted, and just when he said it, his stomach rumbled. Jack snorted and looked at Hiccup.
Good,
Hiccup said, then pointed towards the great hall.
If we go now, we'll get a good seat.
Jamie hadn't noticed before, but the people walking past the forge all seemed to be heading in the same direction now. The great hall. Jamie blinked, sending Jack a questioning look.
We're going to eat with the others?
He asked with a frown.
Are we allowed to? Won't the chief?
He trailed off and looked uneasily at Hiccup, afraid he'd said something rude. Hiccup just smiled and shook his head.
He won't mind,
he said.
As long as you're with me, it should be fine.
That should part wasn't very reassuring, but it was good enough for Jamie. After putting away the sword, they headed for the great hall. The higher they got up the stairs, the more Jamie's stomach rumbled. He guessed he'd been hungrier than he realized. Toothless walked beside him, and since nobody questioned it, it had to mean dragons were also allowed in the great hall during dinner. Of course, Jamie didn't mind. It was thrilling just walking beside the dragon, even when he wasn't doing anything special. Turns out, there were more people inside the great hall than it had appeared from the forge. Most of them had already found their seats, and then there was a line towards the hearth, where people scooped what looked like soup into wooden bowls. Dragons were also padding around, or standing in flocks eating from huge baskets of fish. 100 voices echoed off the walls, making it sound even more crowded than it actually was. They dodged the crowd as best they could as they made for the line. Hiccup did it expertly. Jamie had it easy because he just walked close to Toothless, and the dragon parted the crowd for him. Meanwhile, Jamie frowned. Jack's expression was hard to read, but his brows were knitted, and he was clutching his staff. The hall was crowded, so it was impossible to dodge everyone. Jack seemed to be having trouble with this fact. He kept bumping or barely avoiding bumping into someone, looking somewhat disoriented and slightly annoyed all the while.
Hey, you all right?
Hiccup asked as they got in line.
Huh? Oh, yeah, I'm all right,
Jack muttered, rubbing his shoulder. Hiccup sent Jamie a questioning look, but Jamie didn't have an answer for him.
We can take the food outside if you'd like,
Hiccup offered. Jack seemed to realize that he was frowning, because the frown disappeared very suddenly as he turned to Hiccup. He shook his head in a faint smile. I'm all right, he repeated, more certainly this time. I promise.
Just imagine it's Santa's workshop,
Jamie said in English. Jack blinked, his lips parting in surprise. Jamie almost rolled his eyes. He wasn't blind. He could see that Jack was uncomfortable. He just didn't understand why. These people are almost the size of Yetis, Jack then replied, and Jamie laughed. Hiccup frowned at them, but didn't say anything. However, the person standing in front of them, a Viking just as big and hairy as Phil the Yeti, turned around with a frown. He looked between Jamie and Jack, then sent Hiccup a long look. What are they doing here? He asked. Hiccup's expression darkened. He opened his mouth to answer, but Toothless beat him to it, growling at the man.
Same as you, Hiccup replied. But it also isn't any of your business.
Stoic allows this.
Why don't you go ask him? Jack said, surprising both Jamie and Hiccup.
He didn't look angry, but there was something defiant about his expression. The nervousness from earlier seemed to have vanished. Shorter line for us? The man's brows furrowed. You talk a lot for someone in your position, he rumbled.
All right, Hiccup said, stepping in front of him. If you have a problem, then take it up with Stoic later. We're just here to eat.
You might just be here to eat, the man said, shooting Jamie and Jack a suspicious look. But you of all people should know that they might be here for other...
Oh, sorry, my bad.
Astrid appeared from behind the man, holding a bowl of soup in her hand. Or, it used to be a bowl of soup, but the soup had been relocated onto the man's neck. With her height differences, there was no way Astrid could have accidentally spilled it there, but she smiled apologetically like she had anyway.
I tripped.
The man growled frustratedly, but just wobbled away through the crowd. Astrid shook her head.
5 minutes with the other Berkians and you're already pissing someone off, she said. I think that was you pissing him off, Hiccup argued.
I tripped, Hiccup, didn't you see? Astrid replied with a smile.
Hey, Jack, Jamie,
she then said, nodding at them.
So you finally decided to join us. What happened?
Jack's mood seemed to have brightened considerably.
It was Hiccup's idea, he said.
Uh-huh.
Doesn't seem to be going so well so far,
she observed. I told you things might get bad if you spoke in your language. Jamie shifted his weight. Sorry, we'll be more careful, he said, because he wanted to be on Astrid's good side. Or people can just learn to be a little bit friendlier, Hiccup suggested. Astrid snorted. You're forgetting where we live, she said. Don't worry, you'll learn to deal with them after a while. Oh, what do we have here? A scratchy voice said right beside Jamie's head. Jamie yelped, instinctively jumping away, but then he just crashed into someone else on the other side. He turned around and backed away to see the twins grinning at him elfishly. Well, some are harder to get used to than others, Astrid added. I'm surprised to see you here, Jack and Jamie. One of the twins, Jamie wasn't sure who was who yet, said dramatically. He had a darker voice, so that had to be the boy. He might be the one called Toughnut, but Jamie wasn't completely clear on that. One might start to wonder why that is. The one that was possibly Roughnut grinned at Jamie. We heard you killed a boar last night, she said. So, how did you do it? Jamie swallowed. Was it a boar pit? Toughnut asked. That's a classic. Rough and I can tell you all about it. Later, maybe, Hiccup suggested. Come on, guys, you're scaring him. Jamie wanted to object that he wasn't scared, but looking into the twins' expectant eyes, he wasn't sure if that was true. Scaring him? Roughnut snorted. Hiccup, hiccup, hiccup. A little boy who manages to kill a boar at the fragile age of 11 is no little boy to underestimate. That's not... I don't underestimate him, Hiccup protested. Just at least wait with this until after dinner. Toughnut sent Jamie a long look. We have our eyes on you, Jamie Overland, he said. Jack had been watching in silent amusement up until that point, but at last he interjected. All right, let's just eat now, he said, placing a hand on Jamie's shoulder. And we can talk about this later. He sent the twins a pointed look, making it clear that he didn't want Jamie to be harassed by the twins' crazy theories. Jamie frowned, glancing up at Jack. Jamie Overland, he thought. He also remembered what Gobber had said earlier. A bit mistrustful, that brother of yours. The fact that this entire village thought he and Jack were brothers, it wasn't a bad feeling, but it was strange. His musings were interrupted when the line moved ahead and they got to the soup. They got their portions, and he, Jack, Hiccup, Toothless and the twins, as well as Baby Tooth, of course, headed towards the mostly empty table. Toothless disappeared into the crowd on the way, probably towards one of those huge fish baskets. So, how did training go today? Hiccup asked as they sat down around the table. Jamie sat with Jack on his left, and just when Roughnut made to sit on his other side, Astrid took the seat just in time, as nonchalant about it as she had been when she spilled soup on that other guy. Roughnut was forced to sit on the other side of the table, but not before sending Astrid a scowl, which was smoothly ignored by the latter. Toughnut sat down on Hiccup's other side, leaving Hiccup wedged between the twins. Wouldn't you like to know? Toughnut said, leaning against Hiccup with a toothy grin. Roughnut and I have figured out exactly what we need to do to win. You won't even see us coming, Roughnut promised. Hiccup tried leaning away, but it was a bit hard when the twins were in either direction of him. That's good to hear, he said flatly. He put a hand on either of the twins' shoulders and pushed them away. I'm excited to see, or not see, I guess. Where did you fly off to today anyway? Astrid asked. You didn't show up where we agreed to meet. Like that's unusual, a new voice said. Snotlout appeared from behind Toughnut and sat down beside him, holding a bowl that was almost spilling over with soup. If I had a silver piece every time Hiccup disappeared to... Wait, what are you doing here? Jamie faltered with the spoon halfway to his mouth. Snotlout's eyes were switching between him and Jack, but eventually, to Jamie's relief, they settled on Jack. Hey, I didn't see you at the forge today, Jack said casually, and Jamie wondered if he was the only one to notice the elfish glint in Jack's eye as he smiled at Snotlout. No, I was busy, Snotlout said, then gestured at the others. We have more important dragon stuff to do than to just stay cooped up in the forge all day. Hiccup sent him a sideways look, but didn't say anything. Really? And what dragon stuff is that? Jack asked. Snotlout snorted like Jack had just asked an incredibly stupid question. What dragon stuff is that? He says. Wait. Hey, you didn't answer my question. He turned to Hiccup instead. Are they allowed to be here? Nobody ever said they weren't, Hiccup said irritably.
The only reason they ate at Gothi's place was to rest up.
And they've rested up, all right, Toughnut said gravely. Jamie sent Jack a questioning look, but Jack just shrugged. Better not to question what was going through either of the twins' heads. Don't worry, Snotlout, I promise we won't try anything, Jack said, casually twirling his staff in his hand. Snotlout sent a scowl. Yeah, you better not, he said, pointing a finger at Jack. Because if you do, I'll... Whatever he was about to say, it was drowned out by yet another voice. Or several, actually.
Oh, nice to see you two here,
Fishlick said delightedly, coming up to Jack's other side.
We were looking for you.
Who's... Jack started, but then he turned around and saw the little legion of kids following Fishlegs.
We,
he finished, his face lighting up. Oh, come on, this table is reserved for grown-ups, Snotlout complained. Find your own table, you brats.
Then why are you sitting here, Snotlout?
Astrid drawled. Shut up, Astrid. Jack rolled his eyes.
Be nice, Snotlout,
he said, his tone making Snotlout raise his brows in indignation. Jack turned back to the kids. Ignore him. Why were you looking for us? He asked instead. It was probably an obvious question. All the kids' eyes turned to Jamie, and Jamie awkwardly swallowed the soup in his mouth.
Hi,
he said. Strangely enough, no one said anything. The kids just exchanged glances as if agreeing on something. Everyone except one kid seemed to be in on it, a little redhead around Sophie's age who was staring unabashedly at Jack.
You said we were going to play,
was what she said. Jack faltered.
Oh,
I did, didn't I? He said with an apologetic smile. Sorry, Scotty. Something came up. But how about tomorrow morning, all right?
But I want to play now,
Scotty moaned miserably. Aren't you hungry? Jack asked. Where's your soup? She held out her empty hands, then pointed towards the hearth. Then we should get you some, Jack said, and got to his feet. I'll come with you, all right? That seemed to be satisfying enough for Scotty, because she grinned, bouncing on her feet. I'll be back in a moment, Jack told Jamie, then disappeared into the crowd with Scotty. Jamie just nodded, unsurprised. A few minutes without Jack, no problem, right? He still had Astrid beside him, so...
Jamie.
It was Undis. She was wearing a frown, but Jamie couldn't decide if she looked angry or confused. She nodded towards the other end of the table, where a couple of people had been sitting earlier, but Jamie suspected Hiccup's friend's shattering had chased them away.
Sit with us.
Jamie swallowed.
I'm good, actually,
he said weakly. Fishlick sat down at the table, leaving room where Jack had sat earlier. The rest of the kids, except for Brand and Undis, followed his lead. Undis sent Jamie a long look, but Brand just elbowed her and nodded to the other side of the table, beside Snotlout. They went around and sat down there, much to Snotlout's dismay. Jamie didn't really know why he was nervous. It wasn't like he'd done anything wrong, at least nothing that Brand, Undis, and Hilda weren't also guilty of. Hiccup and the others were chatting together, and Fishlegs was reprimanding Snotlout for how he acted towards children, which left Jamie virtually alone with the other kids. Undis was staring daggers at him, but Jamie pretended not to notice. His soup was exceptionally exciting to play with right now.
Is it true?
Undis asked. Jamie almost wanted to pretend he didn't hear her over the noise, but something told him that wouldn't end well.
Is what true?
He asked innocently. He didn't dare look up, but somehow he knew that Undis was scowling.
You know what I'm talking about, she said. It can't be, right?
Hilda said doubtfully. Jamie looked up to see them leaning their head on their palm, studying Jamie lazily.
I mean, look at him.
Jamie hoped the dim lighting hit the blood rushing to his face.
Maybe we shouldn't talk about that here,
he said quietly, leaning in closer to be heard over the noise. Fishlegs got the wrong idea. Oh, sorry, Jamie, we can switch places, he said, and got up from his seat. In the next moment, Jamie was sitting uncomfortably close to a way too smug-looking Hilda. Another girl leaned forward to look past Hilda at Jamie.
We heard what happened, she said, but Aunt said you...
Brand hushed her.
Quiet, Brenda,
he hissed. As Jamie looked between the two of them, he realized they shared a lot of similarities in appearance. Those two, and a third kid with hair covering his eyes. To be fair, a lot of people on Berk had blonde hair, but these three definitely looked like siblings.
You have to tell us what happened,
Brenda continued.
And how you did it.
He didn't do anything, Hilda mumbled, before taking a spoonful of soup in their mouth. They were right, but Jamie felt a twinge of annoyance anyway.
How would you know? He asked. You ran away.
Hildur raised a brow.
You ran away too, they said. It's not our fault the boar decided you looked the most delicious, or the weakest.
Hildur, Brand said exasperatedly. Hildur shrugged.
I'm just saying.
Brand glanced at Jamie before averting his eyes again. He nudged Undis. He mumbled something to her, but Jamie didn't catch what it was. In response, Undis' eyebrows knitted together, and she shook her head.
No, you,
she whispered.
I already did it,
Brand hissed. They had a short staring contest before Brand groaned. He pressed his lips together and looked back at Jamie.
Sorry for
leaving you, he mumbled, fidgeting with his spoon. And for thinking you were dead and not telling anyone about it. Jamie didn't really know what to say to that. He hesitated, looking between the three of them, and then at the other kids, who were both paying close attention to the conversation.
That's fine,
he eventually managed. He did feel a little bit resentful, because even if it wasn't their fault the boar had gone after Jamie, Jamie wouldn't have been in the woods in the first place if it hadn't been for them. The reasonable part of his brain wanted to say that they didn't mean any harm, so there was no point in blaming anyone, but the emotional part of him, the part that was still jumpy and rattled after what had happened last night, wasn't so quick to forgive. But he tried his best to ignore that part.
I'm all right, so...
He shrugged.
So?
Hildur said, looking up from the soup.
What happened?
Jamie really didn't want to retell it, and especially not to Hildur. He could never tell what they were thinking. Thankfully, they were distracted when Jack came back with Scotty. Here you go, he said, putting the soup down before hoisting Scotty onto the bench. Scotty giggled, sending Jack a look like he was the coolest person alive, which Jamie agreed with, but it made him wonder if he also looked at Jack with stars in his eyes like that. The thought was a little embarrassing. Jack walked around the table and sat back down beside Jamie. The topic of what had happened to the boar went dormant, and Jamie busied himself with eating. The other kids easily found something else to talk about, but nothing to which Jamie had anything to add. Beside him, Jack was quiet at first, but Snotlot was quick to get his attention. Not by being friendly, exactly, but Jack obviously just found him amusing. So far, so good. There hadn't been any more incidents like the guy in the line, except for a few looks every now and then. Hiccup and his friends had an interesting dynamic. It was clear they were close, but for what reason, Jamie couldn't help but wonder. Within half an hour, there had been at least 5 disagreements, 2 almost fights between Fishlegs and Snotlout, and between the twins, and then what Jamie had thought to be a fight, but apparently the twins just liked to bang their heads together so hard they almost passed out. For fun. Still, to weigh up for all of that, there were a lot of laughs and good feelings. Sure, this gang was used to getting on each other's nerves, but that just showed how close they were. They were like family, even if they weren't related by blood. At one point, the conversation had traveled over to the topic of fighting, and Hiccup gestured at Jamie.
Jamie here forged his first sword today, he said.
Jamie felt his face go red.
It's not that good, though,
he mumbled bashfully, trying to fight the smile on his face. Hiccup snorted.
That's not true, right, Jack?
All I know about swords I know from North, but I'm sure he would be impressed, Jack said, smiling at Jamie.
That's North, though,
Jamie said, then frowned a little, because he wasn't used to calling Santa North.
He's impressed by everything.
Jack laughed. Not exactly false, but really. He elbowed him, and Jamie met his eyes with an amused smile. You did a good job. Are you really trying to tell us that you don't know anything about sword fighting, but you know how to fight with that thing? Snotlot said, raising a doubtful eyebrow. Give me a break. Turns out it's slightly cheaper to find a staff in the woods than to acquire a sword, so... Yeah, that's what I'm trying to tell you, Jack replied, then smirked. Besides, it's done its job. You would know, Snotlout. Snotlot's face went red with either anger or embarrassment, or both. He pointed his spoon at Jack. I told you I wasn't ready, he barked. If you're so full of yourself, you think you can defeat this? He flexed. Then bring it on.
All right, you two,
Hiccup interrupted. It looked like he was trying to hide his amusement for the sake of peace around the table.
Challenging people to duels can wait till after dinner. Besides, Jack's arm is wounded, Astrid pointed out. Dueling will have to wait.
Snotlout snorted. That's just a dumb excuse, he muttered.
You broke your arm?
Scotty then asked from the other end of the table. No, don't worry, it's not broken, Jack said, holding up his bandaged arm. Just a bit battered. What? Brand started, but caught himself. Jack sent him an inquiring look, and Brand bit his lip. What happened? He managed to ask, but he looked like he knew the answer and regretted opening his mouth. Jack chuckled. I'm pretty sure it happened when I crashed into Astrid, he said, and turned to the ladder. Sorry about that, by the way. Astrid shook her head. Don't worry about it, she said, then got a thoughtful look in her eyes. Though after surviving that blizzard, I'm surprised you managed to injure yourself by just falling. Jamie put a mouthful of soup in his mouth to avoid talking. Yeah, weird, Jack said, looking at his wrist. His brows knitted together. Maybe someone was looking after us in the blizzard. Jamie almost dropped his spoon. He looked up at Jack. The Snow Queen, he whispered. Jack's face was blank when he looked back at Jamie. Who is... he started, but was interrupted by laughter from the other kids, and from Snotloud. Yeah, Jamie, what about the Snow Queen? Hilda asked, earning another fit of giggle from the kids. Jamie felt himself getting red again. You're the one who told me about her, he said. It's just a story, Brand said, looking like Jamie was causing him a lot of second-hand embarrassment, his shoulders hunched. You don't know that, Jamie insisted, closing his fist around the spoon. Like you know about Jokel Frosty? Anders asked with a smirk. Jamie felt Jack's gaze on him, and his face became even harder. Yeah, he said defiantly. I meant what I said. Kids today. Tufnut's voice was so sudden, Jamie jumped. He was shaking his hand solemnly. They speak of the one who brings devastating winter like she's some kind of fairy tale. Don't you know anything? Roughnut rolled her eyes. I told you, you didn't see the Snow Queen. It was just a weirdly shaped tree, she said, bonking her brother on the head. Tufnut yelped. Hey! He barked, and then the twins really were fighting. The others didn't do anything to stop it. In fact, Hiccup just ducked and moved out of harm's way, switching places with Tufnut to give him more space to pull at his sister's hair. That stole away the kid's attention, which was both good and bad. Jamie didn't want to be in the spotlight anymore, but he also hated leaving the conversation on that note. Jack met his eyes. He smiled and ruffled his hair. Thanks, he whispered, which was enough to brighten Jamie's mood again. Do you know about her? Jamie asked, speaking in English just to be sure. Their voices were probably drowned in the twins shouting either way. The Snow Queen? Jack looked thoughtfully into the air. He started. Okay, knock it off! Astrid's voice interrupted, and her axe buried itself on the table right in the middle of the twins. She had splatters of soup on her face, and Roughnut's bowl was rolling on its side, disappearing off the edge of the table. It seemed the twins' fight had caused a casualty. The twins both froze mid-motion, with Roughnut's palm pressed against Tufnut's jaw, and Tufnut's fists pulling on Roughnut's braid with his other arm pulled back, ready to punch. What? Roughnut said. It's after dinner now. Then take it outside, Astrid snapped, wiping her face. Hiccup was grimacing, then sent Jack and Jamie an apologetic look. Did I say I was going to keep them civilized? He asked. You said you were going to try, Jack said with an amused smile. I guess that was an attempt. The twins continued fighting, and Hiccup nodded. I guess dinner's over then, he said, and got to his feet. Jamie was glad. It wasn't that he was annoyed or scared of the way Hiccup's friends, specifically the twins, acted. The other kids, however, he was pretty sure he wasn't going to make any friends of his own in the nearest future. On the way out of the Great Hall, the kids scattered. Skada said goodbye to Jack one extra time, just to make sure he was going to play with her tomorrow, and Jamie decided he liked at least one of the kids. Skada reminded him too much of Sophie not to. Fishlegs, Snotloud, and the twins went ahead, and only Fishlegs spared them a goodbye before doing so. That left Hiccup and Astrid, and Toothless, who caught up with them as they exited the hall. So, Hiccup said on their way down the stairs, how'd you like the food? Neither Jack or Jamie answered immediately, which made both Hiccup and Astrid crack up. It was all right, Jamie tried, but judging by Hiccup's and Astrid's expressions, he didn't sound very convincing. Yeah, it's usually like that, Astrid said. She yawned and then seemed to think of something. Oh, that reminds me, she said, coming to a stop. She seemed a bit hesitant, but she tried for a smile. I was just thinking,
You can't stay with Gothi forever. My family doesn't mind guests, so if you want to live a little closer to the ground, you're welcome to stay at my place." She obviously hadn't discussed this with Hiccup because he looked just as surprised as Jamie felt. But then he smiled gratefully at her and nodded. "I think you'd go crazy if you stayed with Gothi for too long," he said to Jack and Jamie. "She has that kind of aura." Jack's brows were arched, clearly puzzled. I think it's the path up to her hut that will make me go crazy," he said with a laugh. Jamie looked between Astrid and Jack. He wanted to beg for him to accept, but didn't want to seem too desperate. It wasn't like he was scared of Gothi, but she was definitely not someone he usually liked to hang out with. Not Astrid either, for that matter, but she was a little closer to Jamie's type of person. Jack caught Jamie's eye for a moment before he turned to Astrid and nodded. "We'd like that, I think," he said. Moving to a new place was easy when you didn't have any belongings. Astrid flew up to Gothi's hut with Stormfly just to tell her, and then landed back down by her own hut. When Jamie and Jack had been there earlier that day, Astrid's mother had been on patrol. This time she was home, but only briefly, because she was going out hunting. The concept of a mom going hunting was kind of funny to Jamie, until he actually saw Astrid's mom and changed his mind. She looked just as much like a Viking as almost every other person in this village. In many ways, he saw the family likeness. Astrid's mom's hair was a slightly darker shade of blonde than her daughter's, and she was taller and burlier. Her favorite weapon, like Astrid, as Jamie had been quick to deduce, was also an axe, but when Jamie saw her, she was wielding a crossbow. When she was gone, Jamie frowned. "You still hunt for your food?" he asked, before realizing that that might be a weird question, as someone who was definitely not from the future. "We're a bit low on yaks," Astrid said. She was standing in front of Stormfly, smiling warmly at her. "I'll be right back, girl," she cooed, before turning to face Jamie and Jack again. "There's no hurry yet, but it's better to stock up on animals before the first snow falls." "When does the first snow fall?" Jack asked. "Technically it already did, the day you guys came here," she said. "But that was an unprecedented incident. Winter usually arrives between Halfnu and Gormanur." Jamie wasn't sure how, but he knew that she meant somewhere between the end of September to November. Astrid patted Stormfly one more time before they went into the hut. Inside, a couple of beds were prepared. Well, not beds exactly, but furs were draped over the benches around the hearth. The blankets they'd been sleeping under at Gothi's place were also there. "It's not much, but," Astrid said, brushing some hair behind her ear. "Probably a little better than Gothi's hut, I hope." "Definitely," Jamie said without thinking. Astrid smiled at him. "Good. Maybe you'll even get your own place to stay after a while," she said. "But in the meantime, make yourself at home. I'm going to take one last ride with Stormfly before I go to bed, and Mom will probably be back in a few hours." "You trust us to be alone in your home?" Jack asked. "Ha, Astrid said. "That's a very good point, Jack. If something happens, I know who to blame." Jack laughed. "All right," he said. "Then we won't try anything." Astrid shook her head with an amused huff before she walked out the door. A few moments later, they heard the muffled sound of a dragon taking to the sky. Jamie sat down on one of the beds. The minute he was no longer putting weight on his feet, he realized how tired he was, and he let out a deep sigh. "Tough day?" Jack asked. Jamie looked up at him. Baby Tooth was sitting on his shoulder, and he realized he hadn't seen her at all during dinner. Maybe she'd just been hiding under Jack's cloak or something. After all, there had been a slight hazard of being doused in hot soup. "No, I'm just tired," Jamie murmured. It sounded unconvincing even to himself. After a moment, Jack came to sit beside him. "Kids can be pretty ruthless, huh?" he asked gently. Jamie looked down at his hands. "Anders reminded me of Cupcake at first, but not anymore," he mumbled. "Cupcake is nicer." "You all were a bit wary of her at first too, though," Jack said, and a small part of Jamie's brain wondered how he knew that. How long had Jack been hanging around them, invisible? "Maybe Anders will be the same." Jamie didn't answer. He kicked off his shoes and brought his knees up to his chest. Jack was quiet for a few seconds. For some reason, Jack found it hard to look at him, which was weird because they'd had no problems with it only moments earlier. But now that they were alone, save for Baby Tooth, things felt different. But why? Jamie didn't know. The fact that he was feeling like this was scary all by itself. Jamie, Jack started, if there's something on your mind, you know you can talk to me, right? Jamie swallowed. It's nothing, he said. Are you sure? Yeah. There was another few seconds of silence. Jack propped his staff up against the wall, then leaned back, also kicking off his shoes. He placed his hands on his knees and started tapping a finger restlessly. Jamie could tell he wanted to talk, but he probably didn't want to push, which just made Jamie feel even worse. What was it that Anders said? Jack said after a little while. Joe Cool Frosty? Jamie ducked his head. I wasn't sure if it was safe to tell them, he said. Like, we shouldn't even exist at this point in time, right? I mean, he trailed off. At last, he glanced up at Jack. I think so? Jack blinked. Then he understood. Oh, he said. No, you're right. I'm not that old. And just like that, Jamie realized why he was feeling the way he did. It wasn't like he hadn't realized this before, the fact that he actually didn't know Jack very well, but he was beginning to realize that it bothered him more than he liked to admit. Especially now, after what had happened with the other kids, it was difficult not to feel alone. He missed home, and the closest thing he had was Jack. He just couldn't help but wonder how close to home that actually was. How old are you exactly? Jamie asked. Jack's gaze faltered a little. That would be 317, 318 years, give or take. A light tingle went down Jamie's spine. He'd known that Jack was old, but hearing him talk about it was something else. But 318 years. Jack's undercover persona, Jackson Overland, was 17. Physically, Jack looked around that age. Could that be a coincidence? You said you hadn't been sick in 300 years, Jamie said. Jack nodded. Probably a little more, but I can't remember very well. Jamie remembered something Jack had said right before they found the crystal that started all of this. There's some things that I can't remember that well, and sometimes those memories come back to me. It was a weird thing to say, but Jamie hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now, he couldn't help his curiosity. Why not? He asked. Did something happen? Jack looked away. It's a long story, Jamie said, before pressing his lips together when he realized he'd interrupted him. That was rude. I mean, that's what you said the other day. Jack smiled softly and shrugged. It is, he said. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but all that came out was a sigh. Can't blame you for being curious about that, he mumbled. Jamie wasn't sure what to make out of that sentence. Just a moment ago, Jack had been joking with Astrid and being his usual self. Now, Jamie imagined he could see the years etched into the shadows under Jack's eyes. Is that bad? Jamie asked hesitantly. Jack shook his head. No, he said, but remained quiet for a few more seconds. His mouth opened and closed before he finally sent Jamie a weary smile. It's just that if I tell that story, there's a lot of other things I have to say. They're not all bad things, but... He trailed off and seemed to struggle with his words again. Jamie's chest felt heavy. He didn't like seeing Jack like this, and it wasn't the first time either. There were those moments in Santa's workshop where Jack had looked solemn and worried whenever he'd thought Jamie wasn't looking. And then there was today, before Jack had disappeared into the woods, these long, deep silences where no amount of noise seemed to be able to penetrate his thoughts. And then, of course, there was last Easter. Jamie started, but hesitated. He folded his hands. I mean, maybe you remember it wrong, but... Jack looked quizzical, but nodded encouragingly. It's all right. You can say whatever you want, he assured him. Jamie glanced up at him before looking back down at his hands again. I have been wondering for a while, he said slowly. Last Easter, back when I first saw you, I mean, you were happy, but... He wasn't sure how to ask this question. He picked up again, just to make sure he wasn't wandering out into forbidden territory. Jack wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were fixed on some point on the opposite wall, but he didn't seem to be really looking at it. He was far away, lost in thought, but the minuscule smile on his face made Jamie suspect Jack was replaying the scene from last Easter in his head. "You were sad as well," Jamie tried, even if sad didn't really describe it that well either, recalling the way Jack's eyes had reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. Jack pursed his lips before shrugging. "I wasn't sad, exactly," he said. "I was, ironically, in disbelief. I wasn't sure if it was really happening." "But why?" Jamie asked, getting worked up now. "And when we met the other Guardians afterwards, I didn't think about it at the time, but they acted like surprised? When I talked to you, like you'd never..." Jack nodded. He met Jamie's eyes briefly, and to Jamie's horror, there was a slight glint in his eyes again. The corners of Jack's lips quirked into a smile, but it was bittersweet. "Yeah," he said softly. Jamie stared at him. The silence was suffocating. "Never?" he asked in a whisper. Well, not exactly," Jack said, his brows furrowing. He trailed off again and pressed his lips together. Babytooth chirped softly, putting a hand on his neck. "Don't worry," Jack said. It took Jamie a moment before he realized he was replying to Babytooth. Despite the wetness in the corners of his eyes, his voice was steady and calm. "He should know. It's not like it's a secret, right?" Jamie frowned. "What isn't a secret?" Jack shifted so he was facing Jamie. "Well, it's a long story, so you might want to grab your blankets. You'll probably be asleep by the end of it." Jamie raised a brow. "Yeah, right," he wanted to say. There was no way he was going to miss any of this. He'd been waiting for this moment ever since Easter. But he grabbed the blankets anyway, because the fire in the hearth was beginning to dim. Once he settled down and looked expectantly at Jack, he saw that the tears in Jack's eyes had disappeared. Jack grabbed a couple of blankets as well, even if he was more or less always cocooned in his new cloak. "Where should I start?" he asked, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Jamie didn't know if the question was rhetorical or not, but he answered it anyway. "What happened last Easter?" Jack's thoughtful expression turned to mirth. "Last Easter, as you know, was a special one. I realized it was going to be eventful when a couple of Yetis kidnapped me to the North Pole." He spoke as if reciting a fairy tale. "Earlier that day, I'd been having a bit of fun with some kids, sleighing through traffic and such, the usual." Jamie laughed. "That was the same day?" he asked. Jack grinned. "Yeah, took me by surprise too," he said. "Bunny was there, but of course it was North who planned it. They didn't know me at the time, or they knew of me, apparently, but..." "They didn't know you?" Jamie blurted, confused. "Nope," Jack said, his gaze falling for a moment. We kind of didn't get along before. North and the others, they were the Big Four and all, so..." "The Big Four?" Jack hesitated, then gave a small laugh. "Oh man, there's a lot to explain," he muttered. Babytooth chirped from where she sat on Jack's shoulder, her brows furrowed. "Oh, come on," Jack said, waving his hand. "It's Jamie, and we're in the freaking Viking era. Who cares?" Jamie wasn't sure what they were arguing about, but Babytooth seemed to relent. She gave a small shrug before nestling in the crook of Jack's neck. She didn't look completely convinced, but she sent Jamie a smile nevertheless, as if to reassure him that everything was okay. It made Jamie wonder if what he was about to hear wasn't as not secret as Jack claimed. "You remember," Jack said, "after we defeated Pitch when we were standing on the pond?" Jamie nodded. "You became a guardian," he said, smiling at him. Jack smiled back. "Yeah, and before that..." He trailed off, and his smile faded. "Well, I was just me, Jack Frost. Before Pitch started making trouble, I'd barely spoken to the Guardians before. Except Bunny." He smirked, but shook his head, like that was a story for another time. "I didn't really want anything to do with them. They all seemed so busy and responsible. It just wasn't for me." "Doesn't really sound like you, no," Jamie agreed, then laughed when Jack elbowed him. "Anyway," Jack continued, "since they knew I'd never come with them willingly, they, kidnapped me. Not sure if that was the best solution, but I guess North will be North. And they told me that the Man in the Moon had chosen me to become a guardian in order to defeat Pitch." "And you said no?" Jamie asked. Jack gestured as if that was obvious. Of course he said no. I was far from what they needed, and being a guardian was just not the answer I was looking for. He frowned. And I was angry. The moon hadn't talked to me in 300 years. Why couldn't he just tell me that himself? There it was again, Jamie thought. What did he say? He asked. 300 years ago, I mean. Jack's expression stiffened. He sighed. That I was Jack Frost, he said. Jamie waited for him to elaborate, but he seemed lost in thought again. You didn't know? He asked. Jack shook his head. This is where the story gets a bit... He pressed his lips together. Heavy. It wasn't hard to figure Jack was finding this difficult to talk about, so Jamie didn't press on when he got quiet again. He waited patiently until Jack continued. The thing is, he started, voice softer now than before. I wasn't always Jack Frost. Jamie didn't really know what he'd expected him to say, but it wasn't that. Still, once the words were out, Jamie felt a sense of relief. He looked up at Jack, at his brown hair and brown eyes, and started to feel like he understood. Jackson Overland, he said. That isn't just some random name, is it? Jack smiled. I already knew this, but you're really observant, Jamie, he said fondly. But yeah, it's not just some random name. Which brings me back to the not exactly never been seen before thing. He took a deep breath before he continued. When I first became Jack Frost 300 years ago, I didn't know what was going on. Suddenly, I was just there, existing. The moon told me who I was, and I was quick to find out what I was able to do. He smiled softly, but it was brief. It was fun at first. I mean, I could create snow and ice, and I could fly. It was incredible. But when I found the village, and I tried to speak to people, he looked like he wanted to say more, but no sound came out. Jamie swallowed thickly. They couldn't see you? He asked. The heavy feeling in his chest doubled when Jack shook his head. Not even the kids? He asked. Nobody had ever even heard of Jack Frost, Jack said. There was nothing to believe in. For 300 years? Jack nodded. 300 years, he repeated blandly, gazing into the air. Jamie guessed that he had been wearing some kind of weird expression, because Jack's smile became apologetic when he met his eyes. Is it strange? He asked gently. Is what strange? Jack shrugged. To learn about this, he said. It sure is strange to talk about it. It was a bit strange. Jamie could admit that. For weeks he'd been wondering who exactly Jack was, and now that he was finding out, he felt closer to Jack. But a part of him also felt like this was information he'd rather not know. No, that wasn't it. He did want to know. Sitting together like this, just talking like normal friends, or brothers, as everyone thought, was nice. It wasn't that part that weighed him down. I just didn't think being Jack Frost was so lonely, Jamie replied after a few seconds of contemplation. Jack held his gaze for a few seconds, as if searching for something. For what, Jamie didn't know, and he didn't know if he found it either. It's okay, he sighed, but he wasn't looking at Jamie anymore. It felt like he was trying to convince himself. My memories are coming back, and that time is in the past. He sent Jamie another one of those reassuring smiles. It's nothing to be sad about anymore. There were still things Jamie wanted to ask about. He wanted to know what the deal with Jack's memories was, and he wanted to ask him more questions about what being a guardian was like, or what being Jack Frost was like, or even who Jackson Overland was. But Jamie's chest felt weirdly heavy, and he realized that he was satisfied with what he'd learned so far. That, and it seemed it weighed Jack even more down to talk about it. So Jamie nodded. Okay, he said. It felt stupid not to say anything more, but he didn't know what. Instead, he reached forward and wrapped his arms around Jack's chest, pressing his face against his cloak. Jack stiffened a little, the way he always did when Jamie hugged him, and for the first time, Jamie understood why. But then he relaxed and returned the hug. Jamie swallowed down the lump in his throat. I'm sorry I didn't believe in you sooner, he mumbled. Jack's laugh was short-lived,
but it was the first laugh in the past minutes that sounded real. He hugged Jamie tighter. "You believed in me sooner than I thought anyone ever would," he said. "And that moment was invaluable. I'd have it no other way, Jamie." It offered at least a bit of relief, but not enough to make Jamie let go. He didn't trust his voice either, not that he had any sorts of words that would make things better, so he kept quiet. Jack seemed to realize that Jamie wasn't planning on moving for a little while, because one of his hands started going in slow circles on Jamie's back. Without noticing it, Jamie's eyelids slid shut.